grief is a natural stage and evolution of our human journey. Everyone in their lifetime will go through grief.
Welcome to the Story of Spirit podcast, where practical spirituality meets real life. Hi, I'm your host, Sheetal Story. I'm a psychic medium, grief support counselor, professional astrologer, and a human design reader, and of course, a law of attraction master coach. With my unique blend of spiritual and practical tools, I am here to help you align with your soul-led purpose and ignite a life that sets your soul on fire. In this podcast, we are going to explore the principles of energy, astrology, spirituality, and psychology to help you heal your grief and create an aligned life and business from the inside out. Whether you are looking to deepen your intuition, understand your cosmic design, or transform your business, this podcast is for you. Join me each week for insightful discussions, practical tips, and inspiring stories that will guide you on your journey to living your very best life. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Instagram at Sheetal Story or wherever you listen to this podcast. Let's dive in and start this transformative journey together. Welcome to the Story of Spirit podcast.
Today's episode has been divinely channeled. I asked Spirit, what do we need to talk about? And it came in very loudly that we are going to be talking about the spirituality of grief. Grief is something that has always fascinated me. And looking back on my life, I think I had a natural predisposition to lean into grief. I was very independent growing up because my family was very hardworking and I was the dependable one. So I looked after my brother. I was the one that my parents could count on. I was very responsible. And I lean into hard situations because there was nobody to save me, right? I had to make decisions. I had to be the one that came up with solutions. So when it came to grief, I think I was just a natural friend. You know, whenever bad things happened to people, I would be there for them. And I think maybe as part, looking back now on the wounds of my childhood, I really wanted to belong. So when you look to see when people really need somebody, it's in grief, right? It's when they're going through the hard times. So I would always be there and just to listen, which is interesting because how do you learn that? I think knew how to do that. So I had soul qualities for that ability. Plus I also had the ability to see spirit and energy. So that stuff didn't bother me. I knew that we transcended. So I did know, there's something more than here. I was brought up with the understanding of God is all around us and we are divinely supported. So I remember in high school when people were going through a tough time, I actually had a friend that would call me the bad weather friend, that every time weather got bad, she would find me and I would be there for her. And I remember in our high school, we had a very big ladies' bathroom and there was a lot of tile and we'd sit on our jackets and people would come and speak to me and we would talk about what was happening. I would give them advice. I always said I always had an opinion on everything, which now I understand is a trauma response. So yeah, opinions are a form of judgment, which keeps you safe, right? So interesting that I was very opinionated growing up and I felt that was a superpower. And I realize now that is not a superpower. So in that, grief piece, it's been really interesting that I lean in, when friends are going through a hard time, I'm there. And it has predisposed me, I think, to become a bit of a people pleaser and a giver versus a taker, because I didn't know how to share my grief or where I needed support because it felt wrong. It felt like maybe they would owe me or I would owe. It just felt kind of weird. The owing piece, I just had a conversation with a dear friend about this, is that in our culture, when you do something for someone else, there is an expectation of it being done back. So if, for example, if you invite someone over for dinner, then you are expected to reciprocate that and have them over for dinner as well. And it's meant to have reciprocal friendships. But I think as a little person, I took that on as I need to owe people. So anytime someone does something good for me, I now owe them. And it sits in the owing ledger until I give it back. And so that that always kind of felt hard for me. So I'd rather not owe anybody. So best not ask anybody. And also being super independent, I didn't really know how to ask for help. So it wasn't that if I asked and they wouldn't come through. That was not my experience of it, but I just didn't understand how to ask for help. So when we came into friendships, I was always there for people. I was always somebody that could again hold space for you when you're going through hard times. But I think it really sort of attracted friendships that whenever you're going through hard times, you find Sheetal. When you're going and having fun, you go find someone else. So it was really interesting to notice that pattern. I did have friendships where we did have a lot of fun. We had wonderful memories and things together. It wasn't always, doom and gloom and sadness, but it's interesting to just notice where those sit in my life. So when my mediumship started to come back into my life, when I was in my 30s, after I had my youngest son, I noticed that as I was doing mediumship and developing my mediumship gifts, quite naturally, people would be very upset or sad because they were coming to me because they were going through a hard time in their life. And oftentimes around someone who is passing away, because mediumship is connecting to our loved ones after they've passed away and they're tethered to us by love. So that love connection transcends time and space. And you can go to a medium to help with grieving, but I always like to say to go to a medium after 6 months to a year, because that first sort of 6 months after someone passes away, there's just grief. You're just crying. Like there's a lot of sadness. You miss them a lot, and you're going through the different stages of grief. So seeing a medium during that time, my experience of people who would come to see me before that 6 months was up is that they wouldn't be able to hear what I had to say. They would cry a lot. They'd be very upset. They're in those acute stages of grief. And a medium cannot be your crutch during that time. Same thing goes with seeing a medium every month, trying to talk to your loved one, because that, again, is not helping you with moving through the grief. Grief is a natural stage and evolution of our human journey. Everyone in their lifetime will go through grief. And the more I sat with people who are going through grief, the more I realized I wanted to have more tools to help them with it. Because I am a natural healer. I can sit with you. I can help diffuse your grief. I can make you feel better in the moment. But what then? Am I giving you tools, and am I really helping you, right? Teach a man to fish and you feed him for life. Give him a fish and you feed him for a day. So it's that feeling of I wanted to really help you move through grief, as a client. So I decided to take my grief counseling certification, and I really looked far and wide to see what certifications there were out there. I wasn't called to go back and get my master's, which I could do and get my counseling degree. Master's in counseling, and because I did take psychology in my business degree the first few years, but when I was going through sciences and then moved over to business, when I thought I was going to be a lawyer. If you haven't listened to that podcast, you definitely want to listen to that one. So I ended up sort of researching. I thought, okay, I can go back. I can do it by distance as well, but I don't think I'm being called back to do masters. I need something that's fast and thorough. And everything I looked at was very psychological, very clinical based. And there was only one course that I found that actually spoke to soul pain, the soul's pain in grief. Because when we lose somebody very dear to us, especially someone that is outside the realm of time, where we don't think it's not their time yet, like children or parents that pass early, or things that are sort of outside the passage of time, that we would sort of regularly see that that's the normal time, but not negating the fact that even when it is their time and they've lived a very long life, it's still horrible and sad and can be as devastating. So neither grief is better or worse. And I think that's something I'm going to talk to in a moment, as well as the judgment of grief, that I can't grieve as hard as this person, or this person lived a long life, so I shouldn't feel as sad. No, there's no judgment needed in grief. I saw it at a funeral I had to go to a friend of mine who passed very early. He was in his 40s of a heart attack that was kind of found out that it was a genetic deficiency, sort of something that had run through his family. And when I was at the funeral, there was many people grieving this very handsome man's loss. He was one of my clients and a friend. And there was many people sort of feeling like, well, I shouldn't be as sad. I shouldn't be as sad as this person because I wasn't as close to him or I didn't see him very often. And I said, who says? Like, who says that you can't feel sad? I cry for people on TV all the time because I know what that feels like, or maybe I imagine because I don't actually know. I haven't gone through that. I feel like I need to do an episode on what not to say to a grieving person because I know what you're going through. Even if you have experienced a loss of that kind of relationship or something, you don't actually know, right? Experiences are so individual. So I always say I can only imagine because you can. You don't actually know what that person is going through. Even if you have lost a child and that person has lost a child, you don't know what their grief is like because it's going to be different from you. We do experience grief very differently from each other, especially based on our upbringing, our spirituality, our awareness of things, and also how much grief you've dealt with in your past. Because if you haven't dealt with grief in your past and you just keep trying to bulldoze over and pave over and pave over, guess what? There's going to be a grief that's going to be the needle sort of that just breaks the camel's back, as they say. It's going to be like devastating. Even though it might not be, it will be for you because underneath are all of these griefs that haven't been had dealt with yet, and it's all going to be connected. So oftentimes when my clients come to see me, they feel like I shouldn't be this sad over this. Sometimes it's very, it makes sense. But if your grief is disproportionate or your experience or reaction to something is disproportionate, it always says to me, there's something that you have not healed that is deeper here. Because it's almost like it's built on a house of cards, right? And one thing will topple the entire tower. So we have to look deeper. I had a beautiful client I had the opportunity to work with, and she was sort of, we call it anticipatory grief. So she was anticipating her father crossing into spirit. He was working through dementia. And I'm like, he's got a long life yet. Like I can sort of sometimes feel someone's lifeline, like how long more they've got. Or I used to be able to see someone's grief or timeline as like a graph of ups and downs. Not so much anymore. More so, it's just a knowing now. But I'm like, he's got a while to go. He's not gonna cross into spirit anytime soon. But she was like very visibly upset. So I said, let's uncover what other grief is here. What else has happened in the past that maybe you haven't allowed yourself to grieve, or it did touch your heart, but maybe you just didn't have time to let it grieve. So as we went deeper and deeper and deeper, she had a beloved cat that she had not had the opportunity to grieve because there was so much going on at that time and she was pulled in many different directions. And when we got to this cat, because it was just spirit just said this is where we need to go, so I kind of intuitively knew this was sort of the route of where we had to go. So when I asked her to describe, and she's had other cats, like this is not, it's not like her only cat in life or her first cat or her last cat. Like she's had lots of cats, but this cat I just knew. So I said, tell me about this cat. What was its name? Tell me about how you got it. And she became very, very upset. And the grief started to rise to the surface that had not been dealt with and held wonderful space. And as she moved through it, and we took her through a funeral for this and allowed it to come to some sort of closure. It's you're never over it. Like it's not like, oh, she's never going to miss her cat. Now her cat's fine. She's over it. It's good. It's integrated. No, it's always going to be there. It's like a marble in your pocket. You just get bigger pockets, so you grow around your grief. It's not that it's never going to be there. And I learned that one from my mom. My mom's mom, when she passed away. So my mom, having left Malaysia to come to Canada, there's an implied, whenever you're an immigrant, you're leaving your entire life behind. It's a hard thing to think about, to choose. I think, when I see on the news and they're like, these immigrants are coming to our country, it's like, do you understand what they had to have at stake, to lose and miss everyone, to leave behind their whole life, what they've known, what they've grown up with, all of their favorite snacks and favorite foods and places, and their family, because their life was so bad, or there's a promise of something better in this other country. Like, it is a huge sacrifice, and they're coming literally most of the time with nothing. My parents came to Canada literally with nothing, and they created their life here for us because they knew our future here in Canada would be so much more. There would be more opportunities. My mom said to me, Canada is really the only country I've ever known that you could grow up to be anything you want. There's no bias, which, we know there is, especially if you're an Indigenous person, there is bias there, but there, in her eyes, there was definitely, you could be anything. And she wanted to give her children that. Because in Malaysia, if you're of a certain religion, you are given more opportunities than others. So she just kind of always felt that we might be discriminated or not. We would not be able to be who we are. So being here, really, she had to give up everything to be here. So when her mother passed away, or her mother was sick, she had the opportunity to fly back and be there for her final moments, which is a blessing. But when my dad's mom passed away, there was no opportunity for that. So there's a grief there of making a choice to leave, knowing that you might never ever see them again, and then really never ever seeing them again. So it's complicated. There's no such thing as someone's grief being harder or worse than, or things that you have to deal with than another. That grief was devastating for my parents. And when my mom lost her mom, there was a real feeling of like, I will never not miss her. And it was her last parent as well. So she felt like, she said, I feel like an orphan. I don't have any other parent. I have nowhere to go home to. And I said to her, your home is with me. I was like 12 or 13 at that time. I can't, in my early teens kind of thing, as I recall, anyways. And I think that might have been my grandmother, but my dad's mom. But either way, I think my grandmother passed away when I was older now. My mom's mom, that loss, my mom got to fly back to be with her. But even then, she just said, I just will never not miss her. And I remember that really hitting my heart, that of course, like when my mom passes away, I will never not miss her too. So it's not that it goes away. You don't heal it. I had a mentor once say to me, even when you heal from an accident, there's still a scar. Like, there's scar tissue there, and it's shored up your body in a deeper way or harder way so that you can withstand another cut in that area more than you could have before. So you never heal back to where you were. There's no such thing as like healing back to original, because you're so changed fundamentally by the experience. You are now moving forward into a knowing that you wouldn't have had before. So when I did my grief counseling certification, I chose a certification that had soul pain. She talked about soul pain. And the amazing lady who teaches the course, Dr. Jane Symington, she was an RN, and she experienced a very deep loss of her child, and then noticed that in that time of loss, there was no one that could speak to her soul. Everybody spoke to her mind. There's no shortage of psychologists that speak to the mind, but nobody spoke to the soul. And that's when she decided she was going to become a psychologist, and she was going to create a model of grief and a way to heal it that spoke to the soul. And I was like, yes, this is my woman. So I took the course at, like, surprise, I graduated from it, and I could have gone on to get certified and be recognized with boards and stuff around Canada and the world. But I chose not to, because I wanted to add in the mediumship component of it, which isn't at that time as well, wasn't quite sanctioned. Hard to find a psychologist that will sort of say, yes, as a psychic, you are a legitimate psychologist, even when you pass everything, because their name is attached to you. So I didn't want that. I didn't want someone to have to certify me. I know what I'm capable of. I don't need someone to rubber stamp me that I'm legit. And I passed the course with flying colors. It was amazing. There was a lot of tools, but I realized, that was just one component. So I started to take other classes in polyvagal theory and compassion inquiry, in IFS, interfamily systems. So I took lots of courses, got lots of certifications, probably equivalent to a psychology degree at this point, but not a psychology degree. I am not a certified psychologist, and I stay in my lane. So that is really important to me too, because psychologists have a very important part to play. I feel like everyone needs a therapist. You've gone through so much in your life. Our children need psychologists. We need a third party person to sort of reflect back to us and give us tools. That's an important thing. We're not sitting in a psychologist's office and just saying, this is how we feel over and over and over again and rehashing everything. We need to move the energy. We need to integrate it. We need to give ourselves tools. And that is something I wanted. I wanted to give my clients tools. So did all these certifications, and I did another one called subconscious imprinting therapy, SIT for short. And in using SIT, it also is somatic. So it talks about energy that's held in the body. And we had to read a lot of books about the body and energy. One of my favorites is The Body Keeps the Score and Feelings Buried Alive Never Die. Really great books. So in that, I gave myself a lot of tools to then be a spiritual grief counselor. So I had all the certifications behind it. And in Canada, it's not regulated. So you can call yourself a therapist or a counselor. You can't call yourself a psychologist, which I love that it is regulated. Because if you're wanting to go and be in front of the mind and you have like suicidal ideation, deep depression, even depression in general, personality disorders, PTSD, CPTSD, that all requires a psychologist. And I happily refer over. So all of my clients book through a discovery call. And I always say in that call, we're looking for fit. So I want to make sure that you are a fit for me as much as I'm a fit for you. Right. So my skill set is very specific. I deal with spiritual grief and acute grief, which is what happens at the beginning of the cycle. So as soon as you lose your job, and I just want to also preface that grief doesn't have to be someone dying. It can be any perceived loss. So loss of identity, a diagnosis, a divorce, moving across the country, friendships ending. It doesn't have to be someone dying, stepping into spirit. It is anything that shifts in your life and you're trying to understand what is moved out and who are you now. So when grief comes through, we are often tasked with having to deal with grief in that moment. And that requires tools. So one of the things that I love about spiritual grief is that I have the ability to then give meditations as well. Your loved ones come into the class, or not the class, but the session at the right and perfect moment. And I don't have to manage that. I just have to hold the space. I'll give you tools as things come up, and all the things that I've learned over the years, I get to help you with that. So it doesn't have to just be the mind. We actually deal with mind, body, spirit. Because your spirit, the soul pain that you experience in grief, is potent. It is really potent because it is shifting your soul. You're going through a massive evolutionary stage. Grief is meant to change you. And it changes you in a way that your knowledge becomes knowing. So what do you believe now? What is actually your beliefs? People will tell you that God will be holding your hand during this. And you're like, where is God right now? So you're always testing all those things that you've sort of learned. And there is a cycle, of grief. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, bless her soul, created this back in 1969 from writing the book On Death and Dying. And since then, they have learned, she actually stated that the model of grief was not fluid. It is fluid. It was not linear. And she was excited to see where it would go. So I actually subscribe to 7 stages of grief, which is shock and denial as the first one, where we're just like, no. And your brain needs that. It needs it to just pause for a moment because it needs a little bit of a breather. So in that sort of being in that state of trying to digest what's happening, it's going to be in a bit of shock and denial. And I literally, every time someone tells me someone close to me has passed away, I always inevitably just comes out of my mouth, shut up. Why would you say that? I don't believe it. Like, it's my first go-to, which is ridiculous because no one's going to joke about that. The second stage is pain and guilt, which we feel, should we have done more? There's a pain there. We are really literally can even physically, you can feel that pain. Then anger and bargaining. Anger, right? I should have done more. I can't believe you died. I hate you. Bargaining is, if I had done this, I should have done this. If I had seen you, if I had taken you to the doctor, if I had called, I might have caught you before you did the thing. Depression is deep sadness. And then there's the upward turn, which kind of comes now. You're like, okay, this happened. I don't want to be in this stage anymore. What now for me? And then we move through reconstruction and working through our feelings in real time. And then acceptance and hope is the final stage of the 7 stages. The original one was denial, anger, bargain, depression, and acceptance. I always say the fastest path to peace is acceptance. You might not be there right away, and that's okay. It's not linear. You can move between these stages. And when we can give an outlet for grief to move, we can help feel a little better. So grief is love with nowhere to go. And when we find places for love to go, like lighting a candle, like doing a ceremony, like listening to music, like writing a letter, going to those places that you love to go to together, you're remembering and you're moving the energy. It doesn't just have to sit there and be stuck. And one of the things that grief loves to do is isolate. We think we don't want to be a burden. No one's going to understand. And I'm going to tell you what, 90% of the people in your life aren't going to understand. They don't know how to be with any of these emotions. They just want you to be happy. They want you to be the person you were before grief moved through. And unfortunately, that's just not possible. You can't put it back. You already are so shifted and changed. And grief will move through like a cleaner and change anything that is no longer serving. It's going to wipe those out. It's going to change those people. It's going to let them go, because you just don't have the energy anymore to hold that all together. And it's quite beautiful, because it's meant to shift you, because who you are after grief moves through versus who you are before is grown, right? There's a growth that happens there. It's not easy, but it's a growth through almost walking through the fire. You are walking through the fire without your choice, obviously, because no one chooses to go through grief. It is something that is required as a soul. So if you are moving through grief, I just want to send you so much love. It's not an easy thing to go through. Please don't go through it by yourself. Confide in someone who's near you or who can understand and hold that space. You can reach out to me. I'm a grief support counselor. And if you're in dire need, I encourage you to reach out to BetterHelp or the crisis line for Canada. If you're in Canada, and there's one in the US too, you can Google that. We'll put it into the show notes so that you can have that at your fingertips, because if you need help, then you need help. You need to have that help right away. Okay. So wishing you ease and peace on your journey of grief. And thank you for being here. You're important.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Story of Spirit podcast. I hope you have found inspiration, support, and practical insights to help you align with your soul-led purpose and live a life that sets your soul on fire. If you have enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share it with a friend. Your support helps us to reach more listeners and continues to provide valuable content. I sincerely appreciate every share, and I know it is how most people find me. It is because caring people like you have shared me with them at the right and perfect time. For more resources, insights, and to connect with our community, please visit us at www.sheetalstory.com and follow us on Instagram at sheetalstory. Remember, your journey to a more aligned and vibrant life is just the beginning, and I am here to support you every step of the way. Until next time, stay aligned, stay inspired, and keep shining your beautiful light. This is Sheetal Story, signing off from the Story of Spirit podcast. Here's the legalese that's required by our lawyers. This podcast and the YouTube channel represents the opinions of Sheetal Story and her guests to the show. The content should not be taken as medical, psychological, or financial advice. This series is informational and entertainment purposes only. Because each person is so unique, please consult your healthcare professional, your mental health dream team, your financial advisor, or anyone else that's an expert in the field in where you are thinking of making big choices in your life.